Kia ora. My name is Quentin Painter and I'm a research scientist working on invasive species based at Manaki Whenua Landcare Research in Auckland, New Zealand, and today I'm going to talk about African tulip tree. African tulip tree, or Spathodia campanulata to give its scientific name, is a fast-growing evergreen tree that's indigenous to Central and Western Africa. It can grow up to 24 metres tall and has very attractive orange-red flowers. During the 1930s, African tulip trees were introduced to many Pacific islands as an ornamental plant, but unfortunately they jumped the garden fence and became so invasive that by the year 2000, African tulip tree was nominated as one of the 100 world's worst invasive species. African tulip trees invade agricultural areas, and in 2013 it was estimated that infestations cost farmers in Fiji over 1,300 New Zealand dollars per hectare every year. African tulip tree is also considered a major threat to biodiversity, for example by outcompeting critically endangered native plants, and even its flowers have a dark secret. They are adapted to be pollinated by birds and bats and are toxic to some insect pollinators such as stingless bees. The search for natural enemies began in 2009 when the Secretariat of the Pacific Community provided funding for researchers from Rhodes University in South Africa to conduct surveys of African tulip trees in Ghana. These surveys identified several potentially suitable control agents. In 2014, the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade funded a program that targeted invasive weeds in the Cook Islands, and this provided the additional resources required to complete work on 2 candidate agents. In the Cook Islands, African tulip tree is widespread on Rarotonga. Infestations in native forest are currently patchy, but you often find a halo of seedlings under established trees, and this indicates that over time individual trees will become patches that will slowly coalesce. The long-term prognosis is not good. The first agent released was an aerified mite called Colomeris spathodiae. The mites are tiny, about 1/5 of a millimetre long, but their feeding stimulates African tulip tree leaves to produce conspicuous galls, which are technically known as eronia, and these act as nutrient sinks. Specificity testing conducted in South Africa indicated that the mite will only damage African tulip tree, and in 2016 the mite was approved for release on Rarotonga. Rhodes University researcher Dr. Ian Patterson flew from South Africa to Rarotonga to release the mites in January 2017. They spread rapidly throughout Rarotonga and caused conspicuous damage. However, it was unclear if the damage was enough to control trees, and so work on a second agent, a shiny black flea beetle called Paradibolia caerulea, was progressed. Flea beetles are named that because, like a flea, they're small and have powerful back legs that enables them to rapidly jump and escape danger. The adult flea beetles are only about 2 to 3 millimeters long and feed on the foliage, causing relatively minor damage. The beetle larvae are leaf miners and they consume a lot of leaf material during their development, and this is the damaging stage. Approval to release the beetle in Rarotonga was granted in late 2019. As before with the mite, a colleague from Rhodes University planned to fly to Rarotonga via New Zealand with a consignment of beetles. However, before the flights could be arranged, the COVID-19 pandemic began, and New Zealand locked down and cut itself off from the outside world in March 2020. Nothing could be done until February 2021, when an opportunity presented itself. Landcare Research hired a South African scientist, Dr. Alana Den Brien, who was due to fly to New Zealand to start work. We contacted her and asked if she would be willing to hand carry the beetles to New Zealand, and she agreed, and so the day before she flew to New Zealand, Pippa Musket from Rhodes University handed her a precious cargo of around 100 beetles. When Alana arrived in Auckland, she declared the package of beetles and handed them to the airport biosecurity team before she was whisked away to a managed isolation facility. I then drove to the airport to collect and transport the beetles to the Landcare Research Auckland containment facility. At that time, the Cook Islands border was closed to New Zealand residents, but Cook Islands residents were allowed to travel to New Zealand, and Cook Islands Ministry of Agriculture scientist Dr. Maya Pushko agreed to fly to Auckland to collect a shipment of beetles and return to Rarotonga to release them. However, on the 14th of February, 3 community cases of COVID-19 were detected in Auckland, and travel between New Zealand and Rarotonga stopped. This presented another problem. We only had a few small African tulip tree plants in our containment facility, not enough to maintain a big colony of beetles. Stephanie Morton, who took over control of beetle rearing, restricted beetle breeding to prevent them from eating themselves out of house and home, and slowly increased our capacity to rear beetles by taking cuttings to propagate more plants. In May 2021, community transmission of COVID-19 was again eradicated from New Zealand, and the Cook Islands border opened to all New Zealand travellers. We had to make the most of this opportunity, even though we didn't have many beetles to spare, and on the 5th of June 2021, Stephanie Morton and I travelled to Rarotonga with just 66 beetles. After clearing customs, Maya guided us to a site that looked ideal, an almost pure stand of tall, mature trees with many seedlings in the understory. We didn't know how beetles would behave after release. A big fear was they would fly off in all directions, making it hard for beetles to find one another and mate. We decided to release 40 beetles on branches contained in cloth sleeves so that the first eggs would be close together. We liberated the remaining 26 beetles. When we returned 2 days later, we easily found several of the liberated beetles, and so we decided to free the remaining beetles from the sleeves. After 6 weeks, multiple larval leaf mines were present at the release site, and Maya found beetles in February 22, some 8 months after the initial release. We are confident the beetle is established on Rarotonga, and we have reason to be optimistic that the flea beetle will control African tulip trees, because the larval feeding damage is very similar to that produced by Uroplata girardi, another leaf mining beetle that was introduced into Rarotonga in 1969 to successfully control another major invader, Lantana camara. If the Paradibolia beetles perform as well as Uroplata, that the African tulip tree will have met its match and will no longer be a threat to Rarotonga's forests in the years to come.